All right, here we are in Chapter 4, Section 1, and we're actually going to do Section 2 because Section 1 is really short. So Section 4.1 and 4.2, these are all about carbon molecules because carbon is this wonderful and amazing element that makes up a lot of living organisms, in fact, the majority of them, and it makes really fabulous and interesting compounds that we are going to look at more closely. Whoa, I didn't mean to do that. How do I do that? Go away, go away. Okay, so if we take a look at carbon, it can form these wonderful, large, complex, and diverse or very different types of molecules. So it doesn't just form one kind of molecule or a few kinds of molecules. It can make many, 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 many different kinds. So compounds that have carbon in them tend to be very different. Oftentimes we talk about carbon as this backbone of life. And you'll know that the word backbone is a bone that's on your back. It's your spine, right? Here's a picture of an elephant skeleton, and this is the backbone here, right? Here's a snake, and we can see the backbone that kind of spirals around, right? And so this backbone is a bone that's really important for the entire structure, right? And so when we think about carbon, it actually forms these kinds of sometimes long chains, not always long chains, but these chains that often create the structure of really important molecules in living organisms. So this one right here that we have is a long carbohydrate chain that forms lipids. This is a lipid or a fat. Here we have a short carbon chain that makes up a really important amino acid. And you might remember from your biology classes that amino acids make up proteins. And here we have another carbon chain, but it's a carbon ring with an oxygen, and it's making up glucose, which is a carbohydrate. So carbon is really important for all kinds of molecules, biological molecules. So when we talk about one area of chemistry, sometimes we talk about it something we call organic chemistry. And organic chemistry is just a term to describe chemistry, an area of chemistry that focuses on carbon-containing compounds, right? So it's going to look at these carbohydrates, it's going to look at amino acids, it's going to take into consideration fatty acids or lipids, as well as other types of molecules like nucleotides that we will learn about. And so we're going to focus in on each of these types of molecules I think it's in Chapter 5. So that's coming up. The book talks briefly about this experiment that was done by a graduate student in like the 20s. I forget when. The dates in your reading. Actually, I could probably look it up really quick right now. Oh, 50s. Wow, not even close. 1953, Stanley Miller. He was a graduate student in the University of Chicago. He did a fabulous experiment where he tried to recreate the types of conditions that we thought might exist in the oceans or in the seas on Earth billions of years ago, and to give us an idea of where these organic molecules came from. Because there's no evidence that there were organic molecules to begin with. Maybe there were some, the elements were there, but they weren't in these molecules. And so he did an experiment to try to see whether he would be able to recreate or make the same kinds of conditions that were in the aquatic environments when the Earth started, and see if he could figure out how those molecules came about. And sure enough, he did. He did these experiments where he had salt water, he added heat to it, he ran current through it with ammonia and with hydrogen gas and methane in the atmosphere, and sure enough, he ended up making some organic molecules. So this experiment gave evidence for where these organic molecules came from, how they came about, right? And they became incorporated into living organisms in much more complex ways, and we'll talk more about this when we learn more about evolution. you should just know that this experiment happened in the 50s, not the 20s, like I thought. That's not what I want to do. Let's do that. So organic molecules are really complex, and the reason for that is because carbon is a sweet element that can make 4 bonds. It doesn't just make 1 bond with something, it doesn't make just 2 bonds, not even 3. It makes 4 wonderful bonds, and it can be with all kinds of elements, right? And those are usually covalent bonds. The reason why carbon does this is because it has 4 unpaired valence electrons, right? So you'll remember carbon has its 4 valence electrons, and those electrons will try to be as far away from each other as they can be. And so what we call that is that they're unpaired. They don't have a pair electron. So each of those electrons is kind of looking for a partner, and it's going to get that partner from some element that comes over, whether it's chlorine, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's something else. But some element that comes over to share its electrons with carbon, okay? And so it can make 4 bonds, and sometimes we call that we refer to that as being tetravalent. And that is why carbon can make these complex molecules, because every carbon atom that's in our molecule can have 4 things attached to it, okay? So you can take a look at this diagram here. It's basically what I drew before. Carbon's 4 valence electrons, and here you see 1 hydrogen brought an electron, this other hydrogen brought an electron, this other hydrogen brought an electron, and this one did too, right? Satisfying carbon's octet, the desire to have 8 electrons, and making 4 separate bonds, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, some examples of the different types of compounds, or the different ways that carbon can make these 4 bonds, is it obviously can just bond with 4 separate things. Right here in our methane, which has a molecular formula of CH4, we see that carbon makes 4 bonds, one with each with 1 hydrogen, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. And here we can actually represent that as what we call a ball and stick model, because you have these spheres that represent each atom, and they're connected by lines or sticks, you might think about it. And that shows not only how the different atoms are connected, but kind of like their 3-dimensional shape in space, which you can also see to some degree with this space-filling model, where it just represents each atom as this large sphere, and there's no lines to connect them to show the bonds, but it shows how they kind of overlap. But carbon doesn't have to bond just with hydrogens, right? Carbon can bond with a lot of different things, including another carbon, right? So here you have a carbon that's attached to another carbon, so that's one of its bonds. It's 1 bond for each of them, and then they each are attached to another 3. Oops, that's not what I want to. Another 3 hydrogens, right? Satisfying the octet that way. But it turns out that carbon can also make a double bond. It can even make a triple bond, actually. And this double bond also satisfies carbon's desire to make a certain number of bonds. So here, this carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds, right? And this carbon also has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds, right? So it satisfies the octet in this particular chemical, which we call ethene, and it has a formula of C2H4. And I'm going to teach you guys something that will hopefully help you remember how these bonds form, not just for carbon, but for hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So hydrogen, when it forms bonds, it will form, it always wants to make 1 bond, right? Because it has 1 unpaired valence electron that's looking for a partner. Actually, maybe I should draw that this way, but there's like an available space next to it, right? Oxygen is going to want to form 2 bonds because it has 2 unpaired electrons that are looking for a partner. Nitrogen is going to want to form 3 because it has 3 unpaired electrons, even though it has a total of 5 valence electrons, but 2 of those 5 valence electrons are paired. And then we have carbon, which will form its 4 bonds because it has those 4 empty spots for electrons. And the way to remember this is HONC 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And this all tells you the number of bonds each of these elements will like to form. So when you have carbon, you can have carbon, and you know each of those carbon is going to have 4 bonds. If you put an oxygen there, you know it's going to need 2. If you put a hydrogen there, you know it only has that 1. If you add a nitrogen, you know that nitrogen is going to need another 2 things that are attached to it, and you can kind of go about like this to construct molecules of different kinds. And they always will want to follow this HONC 1, 2, 3, 4 rule, which has to do with the valence electrons. So we can look at an example of a molecule that you might be remembering from your chemistry classes, because I think you guys did some experiments with it, or will do if you haven't yet. And we can practice numbering the bonds that are at each atom. So thinking about how many bonds each atom has. And we can start with this hydrogen here. So this hydrogen has 1 bond, right? This hydrogen over here also has 1 bond. And then this nitrogen, or let's go to this hydrogen, it also has 1 bond. This hydrogen has 1 bond, right? This nitrogen has 1, 2, 3 bonds. This nitrogen has 1, 2, 3 bonds. This carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. And you'll notice the oxygen has how many bonds? Yeah, it's 2 bonds, 1, 2. Even though it's a double bond, each of those lines counts as 1 bond. Okay? And so this all follows the HONC 1, 2, 3, 4 rule. So, moving along, I know I'm going pretty quickly, but this stuff should be pretty straightforward. Pause and rewind the video if you think you need to rewatch it. Carbon will form all kinds of chains, and these chains, so like these series of carbons that are attached to each other, will make up all kinds of organic molecules. But it turns out that the variation, the differences that we see between molecules isn't just in the number of carbons, right? You can make a variation in the number of carbons that are connected to each other, right? Here you have 2 carbons that are connected to each other, and here you have 3. But you can also create variation in the branching, right? So you can have 4 carbons in a straight line, or you can have 3 carbons that are connected in a straight line with another carbon that's coming off in the other direction. We call that branching, because you're creating molecules that aren't just straight lines, but they have branches to them. The other thing that carbon can do is that it can form double bonds, right? So when you have double bonded carbons, that is a different type of molecule than if you just have carbon, 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 carbon with single bonds. So that's another way that we see variation in organic compounds. And then there's also rings. That's a really amazing thing about carbon, is it can form these wonderful rings, and these rings are all carbon chains. Sometimes they have nitrogens and oxygens attached to them, but they're carbon-based, and they allow for a great amount of variation, a great amount of diversity in the types of molecules that carbon makes. Carbon is really great at making molecules that are only carbon and hydrogen. That is very common. Hydrogen really likes to bond with carbon, and so it will make these large, sometimes organic molecules, and we can call those carbohydrates, but we can actually call them hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons means that there are only carbon and hydrogen in the particular molecule. What's cool about hydrocarbons is that if they are burned, if they react with oxygen in a heat-releasing reaction, they release a lot of heat energy. So fossil fuels, for example, are hydrocarbons, and when they are burned, as we know, if you've been reading about fossil fuels, they generate a huge amount of energy. They allow our cars to move. They allow us to do all kinds of wonderful things. And I think that's all I wanted to say here. Oh, here are some examples of various hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons can be really, really different. There's all kinds, right? You can have simple carbon with 4 hydrogens right here on these diagrams. It's a little bit hard to see, but the red spheres are carbons, and the blue aquamarine colored spheres are hydrogens, right? So methane is, like we said before, it's CH4. Here in ethane, you have 2 carbons with each 3 hydrogens, right? Propane is 1, 2, 3 carbons, right? Butane is 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons with hydrogens everywhere. But then you can have butane in a slightly different form where it still is 4 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, but there's branching going on, right? You can have pentane, which has 5, pent, as in 5 carbons, right? But that can also be cyclopentane, right? And so it's pentane, but it's as a ring, right? A pentagonal ring. And you can also have hexane, right? So that's 6 carbons, and those are also in the shape of a ring. So in general, we can see that the hydrocarbons have all kinds of variation, not only in the number of carbons that are in their chain, right? We have some that have 8, some that have 16 carbons in the chain, but also in the shape of the chain, and that's a big takeaway here. All right, so let's talk about isomers, right? So we had talked already about isotopes, but those are different than isomers, but they're kind of on the same page, right? So iso is referring to something that is like a variation of something that we have, right? Isotopes are variations of different types of elements in terms of the number of neutrons that they have, but it's the same element. And an isomer is the same type of molecules. They have the same molecular formula, right? So they have the same number of carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, what have you, but they have a different type of structure, right? And that structure might be in terms of how the atoms are arranged, right? So you might have a carbon that's connected to a carbon that's connected to a carbon, and those all have hydrogens around them, or to another carbon after that. Or you could have a carbon and then a chain of 3, and then each of those carbons have all their respective bonds filled, right? So the connections are different. You can also have geometric isomers, right? So you can have the same connections between the atoms, but they are going to be arranged differently in space. And I'll give you an example of that afterwards. And then you can also have enantiomers, which refers to a specific type of isomer, also sometimes called an optical isomer. And these are molecules that are exactly the same, except that they are mirror images of each other, right? So if you look at yourself in the mirror, it is not the same. You wouldn't actually be able to take your image in the mirror and turn it around and put it on your face, right? Or like your hands are mirror images of one another, right? One is has like the same shape as the other, right? They're reflections of each other, but you can't actually put your hands on top of each other and have the exact same shape. There's a difference between them. They're mirror images. So those are different types of isomers. So let's look more closely at structural isomers. Structural isomers, like I said before, are isomers that have different connections. Okay, so just remember structural, their structure is different because they have different connections, but they have the same atoms, but they're connected differently, right? So here we have an isomer. Keep in mind that these crosses are each a carbon. It's just a shorthand way of drawing it because we know the carbon is there. It's a backbone. We just assume that it's there. So in all of these we have 3 carbons, right? And we have our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hydrogens, and we have our 1 oxygen. But they're all connected in different ways, and so all of these are actually different molecules. They have different properties, and that's really important. A geometric isomer, what you need to remember about those is that they are, so when they're a geometric isomer, the connections are the same, but the arrangement is different. And when we talk about these, we talk about usually cis-trans isomers around a double bond, right? So when we have a double bond between carbon, the carbon can have the hydrogen, or it can have, how does that explain this? The molecule is flat, and so it can have the different things that are connected to it oriented in a different way, right? So when you have your double bond, it can have, let's say we're talking about chlorine here, it can have those chlorines on the same side, right? If we look at our molecule here, those chlorines are on the same side of this molecule, and so we call that cis for same. And they can also, when we look at the double bond, if we look at the molecule down the line, they can be on opposite sides of that molecule. And that's a different shape because that bond can't rotate. It's a bond, and so it can bend a little bit, but it's not going to switch around and change its orientation here. These bonds are like a bridge. It's not going anywhere, right? And so when the atoms that are on it are connected on different sides. They're like across from each other. We refer to that as trans, right? They are on different sides, okay? So those are geometric isomers. And now optical isomers, which have always given me a big headache in organic chemistry. All you need to know about optical isomers is that they are mirror images of each other, right? So if we have this molecule, it's a carbon, it's a hydrogen, it's a chlorine, it's a bromine, and it's an, iodine here, okay? So there are 4 different things that are connected to a carbon. They have to be 4 different things that are connected to it, right? You can have a molecule that is the mirror image of it, bromine, chlorine, hydrogen, chlorine, and these are not the same molecules. That's what you need to understand about this, is that these 2 molecules are different molecules, because if I were to move this one over here, you would have a chlorine, you would have a bromine, right, coming out kind of forward, you would have an iodine kind of going backwards, you would have a hydrogen up here, and you would have a chlorine kind of coming forward, and that is not the same. I can rotate this molecule here as many times as I want, but it's not going to be the same as this one here. And the reason why we talk about this is because each of these different isomers have different properties. And I'll tell you about some examples of times when optical isomers caused big problems because they had different properties, and some of the stories are actually really tragic. So if we have an example here, practice, what kind of isomer do we have here? So pause the video and take a moment. Is it a structural, geometric, or optical isomer? So hopefully by now you figured out that these are geometric isomers, because what we're looking at here is how the different atoms in our molecule are arranged, not how they're connected, right? They're all connected the same way, right? You have a carbon with an X, which could be a chlorine or whatever, and a hydrogen. These are connected in the same way, but they are oriented differently around the double bond. So whenever you see a double bond like this, you might be thinking geometric isomers. Let's go to the next one here. What kind of isomer is this? Hopefully you took a moment, paused the video, looked it over, and you quickly realized this is an optical isomer because these 2 are mirror images of one another, where you have a carbon that's connected to 4 different types of atoms or molecules. Let's go to the next one here. That's not what I want to do. So, what kind of isomer do we have here? Hopefully by now you figured out these are structural isomers because they are the same elements that you have there, the same atoms and the same numbers of them, but they are connected in different ways. Here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons, and they are just in a straight line with their 12 hydrogens around it. And here you have 1, 2, 3 carbons that are connected to another 2 carbons, right? They're connected in a different shape, and then they have the same number of hydrogens around it. And hopefully you went and you counted through all of the hydrogens. So the reason why we care about isomers is that it doesn't only matter what elements you have in a compound or how many you have, but it also really, really matters how they are connected. And the reason for that is because, like I said before, that different isomers have different effects. They have different properties. They do different things in a living organism. So for example, in the case of ibuprofen, which maybe you've taken before as a painkiller, if you have one particular isomer, here we're talking about optical isomers or enantiomers, this particular orientation of it is totally effective and it will kill your pain, right? But if you have this other isomer, which is exactly the same except it's a mirror image of it, it's going to be totally ineffective and it's not going to help you at all. So it's really important for chemists to know which isomers they have, and they have great techniques for figuring that out. You can look at the other example yourself. Let's look at a case, and this is actually a really sad story of an optical isomer gone wrong. So in the 1950s, a new drug came out that was like a pharmaceutical drug to help pregnant women deal with morning sickness. Because as you might know, when a woman is pregnant, sometimes in the morning she feels sick, and that can be really unpleasant and can make life very difficult for women, especially if they have to continue working or they have to continue their lives as they would normally. They can't just be at home and be sick. And so this drug came out in the 1950s in Germany and the United States and Canada, and it was called thalidomide, and it was this wonderful pharmaceutical drug that really took away a lot of this morning sickness. So women started taking it, right? It was prescribed by their doctors. It helped them with their problems. Unfortunately, what happened was that women started giving birth to children that were very, very seriously deformed. And I say that in the sense that the children oftentimes didn't have arms or legs. Oftentimes the children died too. They were just not born. They weren't born alive at all. But when they were born with very deformed or no limbs, right? And this is really sad. This picture here is very sad to see, but if you look up thalidomide, you'll see even more tragic pictures. And the reason why I talk about this is because as soon as this started happening, you know, pharmacists and scientists didn't understand. Like, sometimes the drug worked, sometimes it was fine, and sometimes it wasn't. And what they found out was that thalidomide, when it's in the form of one enantiomer, it was really dangerous, but when it was in the other form, it was perfectly safe, right? And so these two molecules are almost exactly the same, except for this carbon right here, which is the optical center of the carbon, and they are different enantiomers, right? And so one of these was really dangerous, whereas the other one was perfectly fine. So if you want to know more about thalidomide, you can do all kinds of research. It turns out that it's actually still being used. It's just not being given to pregnant women because that was a problem. So that's really interesting. You should look more into it. So if we take a look at this example here, you can do a practice problem where we look at what are the structural isomers of butane. And butane is C3H8, right? So take a moment to draw those out. So hopefully you've drawn out some of these structural isomers of butane, and what you'll probably find out is that it actually only has one structural isomer. 3 carbons connected in a chain with a bunch of hydrogens around it. But maybe you thought, hey, I can draw this one out where it's carbon-carbon and then another carbon is connected at an angle to my carbon here. But that actually is not a different structural isomer. That's just this one here, and it's bent, right? The carbons are connected in the same way, where you have one carbon connected to another carbon connected to another carbon, and the middle carbon has 2 hydrogens connected to it. So this is actually the same structural isomer because they are all connected in the same way. Because you could just bend this down and you would end up with the same kind of chain as you had here, okay? So this stuff takes some practice. If you're like, what, I don't know what's going on, give yourself some time. You'll get better at it with a little bit of practice. And do a lot of problems. Okay, so I'm going to go through something now that's going to be kind of boring, but I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. You should go back and study it and memorize these, this information that I'm going to give you. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is functional groups. So when we look at carbon, or when we look at organic compounds, a lot of times it's a bunch of carbon, and then it has specific kind of groups that are attached to it, and these groups we call functional groups because they have specific properties, right? And they're groups because they're not just one atom usually. They are a nitrogen with a hydrogen, or a couple of hydrogens, or an oxygen with a hydrogen, right? They're multiple atoms that are connected. So for example, we can look at testosterone and estrogen here, which are 2 really important sex hormones, right? Estrogen, or estradiol, sometimes this is called, is found in larger amounts in women. Testosterone, as you know, is found in larger amounts in men, although both men and women have both of these, right? And so these, again, when we draw these carbon-containing compounds, We don't draw the carbons in a lot of the time because we just know that they're there. We just assume that they're there because carbon is this backbone. So these structures here, every time there's a bend in the line, that means there's a carbon, right? So there's a carbon here in this bend, there's a carbon here in this bend, the line bends here, that's a carbon, right? And that carbon is connected to however many hydrogens it needs to fill its 4 connections, right? So in estradiol, right, we have one group right here where a carbon is connected to an oxygen and hydrogen, and that has a specific kind of name. We have one here as well, another OH. Or we can see a carbon here that's just connected to a double bonded oxygen, and we actually have a special name for that as well. This carbon is connected to another carbon and 3 hydrogens, and that is another type of functional group that we care about. And so in chemistry, it's useful to know what these functional groups are, what we call them, and what their properties or what their characteristics are, because these functional groups affect how this entire molecule will behave, chemically speaking. So the first one I want to talk to you about is a hydroxyl group. So a hydroxyl group is a name for a functional group that is an OH, like we saw in the estradiol, right? And you can read through this stuff yourself if you want, but the bottom line is that this OH is found in alcohols. So when you have an OH on your molecule, a lot of the time it is called an alcohol. It's a different type of alcohol. You've probably heard of alcohol in terms of what people consume. That is just one type of alcohol, that's ethanol. However, there are many, 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 many different types of alcohols. They're basically compounds that have these OHs on them. And what's cool about this OH is that it can form hydrogen bonds with other molecules, and often it makes one of the sides of the molecule a little bit polar, right? So it will draw the electrons in a little bit to itself, because oxygen is pretty electronegative. That's hydroxyl. Next one, we have our carbonyl group. And so this one is tricky because you're going to mix it up with the next one, which is a carboxyl, right? So carbonyl is when you have a carbon and it's connected to other carbons, and that carbon has an oxygen that's double bonded to it. Okay, so here we have carbon, 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 and it has a double bonded oxygen. There is another type of carbonyl where you have a carbon that's connected to a carbon with the double bonded oxygen, and it has a hydrogen next to it. And you don't need to really know about the distinctions. One is an aldehyde, one is a ketone, but they both have this carbonyl group, which is different from the carboxyl group. And the important things about a carbonyl group is that we find this group in a lot of different types of sugars and ketoses, and remember the oxygen is relatively electronegative, so it will make your compound more. So our next functional group that we're going to talk about here is the carboxyl group, right? And so these groups are very similar to the carbonyl group. However, the key difference here is that you have a carbon that's double bound to an oxygen, but it's next to an oxygen and a hydrogen. So it's a carbonyl group next to a hydroxyl group, and together we call that a carboxyl. Okay, and these are found in compounds that form acids, specifically called as carboxylic acids, and they are organic acids, right? So you may have heard of acetic acid, which is a type of carboxylic acid, and it has 2 carbons. One of those carbons has a double-bounded oxygen and a hydroxyl group attached to it. So usually these are acidic functional groups, and that's about all you need to know about them. Moving along, we have 7 in total, so we have another 4 to go. Another important type of functional group is the amino group, which is different from the amide. The amino group has an NHH. So you have a nitrogen that's attached to a carbon that's attached to 2 other hydrogens, or to 2 hydrogens. And these are found in our amino acids, right? So they are an acid as well, they will tend to pick up another hydrogen if they are in water. So sometimes you'll see these when they have the nitrogen is with its 2 hydrogens, but sometimes you'll see it with 3. And now it's an ion because it has a charge, has a plus charge because it has that extra hydrogen. It's not hydrogen, it's kind of like stealing away the ion or the electron from the nitrogen, making it positive. And we call these, when they are part of a compound, we call those compounds amines. Next, we have the sulfhydryl group. And that's when you have a sulfur and it's connected to a hydrogen. When it's part of a compound, we a lot of times will refer to it as a thiol, although not always. Sometimes it will be part of a compound like here in cysteine, and the thiol is just there, but it's not part of the name. Thiols are really important when we form cross-linking. They form bonds with other sulfur-containing compounds, and they're really important for the structure of proteins, right? So when someone has straight hair, or rather when someone has curly hair, part of that has to do with the fact that the keratin has these bonds between the sulfurs, and when someone gets their hair chemically or permanently straightened, or curled for that matter, one way or the other, it's either breaking or forming these types of bonds. So these sulfur cross-linking covalent bonds give proteins their structure. Next group, phosphate. Phosphate, as you might imagine, or as you might already remember, is a phosphorus, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygens that are attached to it. It is actually an ion. Sometimes, though, it will connect with another part of the molecule. These oxygens will still have a negative charge to them, but they will be part of this compound. We call these phosphates, as I already said before, and they are a really important part of cell membranes. And I think we're on to our last group. Methyl groups. Methyl groups are just a carbon that's connected to 3 hydrogens, and then obviously another carbon. So it's our CH3. So we can have a molecule here and it has all kinds of stuff going on, but when it has a CH3 hanging off of it, we call that a methyl group. Sometimes we refer to methylated compounds, right, that they have a methyl group that is part of it. And I know what you might be thinking, wait, that sounds like meth, and the reason why meth is called meth, it's short for methamphetamine, which it means that it has a methyl group as part of an amphetamine group, right? So whenever you see the word meth, that is referring to this CH3. Science. Science in the real world. And methyls groups are a really important part of DNA. They are important for regulating whether genes are expressed, which we'll learn more about later when we get into the DNA section. In general, they're just really important for all kinds of parts of organic molecules. And I think that's all I want to teach you. Oh wait, no, there's a little bit more. Almost done. Almost there. A really important type of phosphate that we'll learn more about is adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. It's a phosphate-containing compound that's used for transferring energy in cells, and it has 3 phosphate groups that are connected to each other, so PO4, 3 times, and it's connected to a sugar and an adenine, and it's a really important compound for cells having energy to do everything they need to do. And essentially, the way that the energy is released is when one of these phosphates gets broken off, there's a ton of energy that's released, and that is useful for the cells. Alright, I think this has to be the end. Yeah. So let's practice this by circling and identifying our different functional groups. So pause the video and try to figure it out yourself. I'm going to go over the answers now. So NH3 here, right? That is our amino group. Here we have an SH. right? So that's our our thiol group. We're just going to have thiol group. Can't do this right now. Here we have a carbon, and it's connected to a double bound oxygen and a hydrogen, right? So it's not connected to a carbon and an OH. So I know this is my carbonyl or carbonyl group. Here I have a PO4. This is a phosphate group. And lastly, I have my OH, which is my hydroxyl group, also my alcohol group. So, there we go. Alright, that's all. I'm sorry this video was so long. I'm really tired. I am ready to go to sleep. I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.